Welcome everybody to this session 8 on the important issue of advancing the global campaign for a right to clean air. This was something that those who took part in our first international conference in 2018 asked the Ramphal Institute to pursue, and in 2019 Dr. Sindra Sharma Kushal, who is actually moderating the next session after lunch, at least after lunch here, a paper on the possibility of achieving such a right based on the experience of the right to clean water, which was the result of 10 years campaigning, and the United Nations agreed to that in 2015. Many of us who were tuned in yesterday will have heard the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Patricia Scotland, say that she thought human right to clean air is a basic human right. And those of us who've been working for this are much encouraged. We have also learned that there are different elements here, and I'm sure we'll discuss them in the course of today's debate. Among those things that are going on are the campaign for a right to a clean and healthy environment, which some 60 states, including many African Commonwealth states, support, and which Dr. David Boyd, who we will be hearing from shortly, who is the UN Special Rapporteur, hopes will get support at the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly this year. There has also been other developments which are relevant. As was discussed yesterday, there was this important coroner's decision in the UK last year related to the little girl Ella, who died from asthma and excessive exposure to road transport emissions. And the coroner decided that this was a case of death by air pollution. And this was obviously important for all common law jurisdictions which apply throughout much of the Commonwealth. And as a result of that, there is a campaign running in the UK for what is known as Ella's Law. It is supported by the Murdoch Press, the Times newspaper, for example, which is keen to see a new Clean Air Act, which would put into legislation in the UK a real commitment to a human right to clean air. This is obviously something that follows up the first Clean Air Act back in 1956, which put paid to the terrible smogs in London at that time, and would be a lasting legacy for her. Yesterday, we heard Simon Burkitt in one of our sessions say that that there is a real call for a Clean Air Act now, which would also include tighter WHO regulations. We are expecting these, or he says we can expect these to come in May, and this is going to be a new benchmark for Commonwealth countries throughout the world as to what clean air or polluted air is now being recommended. So this is a time of change, and I think this is a time that is very good to be looking at all of this, because there are many disputes as to the right way forward. Which is the priority? Is it a right to a healthy environment? Should we be pushing on for a right to clean air? What will this actually mean in different countries? Because there's always been a question mark as to how far UN rights of any kind are actually translated into the experience of individuals in the countries concerned. And it is therefore with great pleasure that in welcoming you, I welcome 4 participants today, only 2 of whom are actually with us live. But the first is a very distinguished person, Henrietta Fore, who is the American 7th Executive Director of Unicef, which is one of the sponsors for our event today and yesterday. She was appointed in January 2018 She has a long record of public service, championing economic development, education, health, humanitarian assistance. And between 2007 and 2009, she was administrator of US Agency for International Development, the first woman in that position, in charge of a budget of 39.5 billion US. And actually, the budget last year, in 2019 for UNICEF was only 6.4 billion. So it is an illustration of the difference in scale between some of our international agencies and individual wealthy countries. The role of UNICEF has been implied several times in our discussions already. The danger to women and children, particularly from indoor air pollution, has been stressed. We had some information yesterday about damage to unborn children from mothers living in heavily polluted circumstances. So we really welcome her participation. It will, I'm afraid, have to be recorded. She has made a statement. There will be a video which we'll put up shortly. The second recorded statement comes from Dr. David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, who is also an Associate Professor of Law, Policy and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. So I think it will still be before dawn in Vancouver at the moment. He has written several books, 10 books, and over 100 reports, and he is jointly appointed at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And as I mentioned, it is his hope that in the course of this year, the UN will agree a right to a healthy environment. And he sees this as a major step forward. Then the next person we're very honored to have here is a very distinguished journalist, writer, documentary filmmaker, and academic, Sanjoy Hazarika, who is International Director of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative in New Delhi. That is the premier organization in civil society pushing for human rights around the Commonwealth, with offices also in Accra and London. And he has recently been part of a call in London on work that is being done there to end modern slavery. This is a major recent campaign and an effective one, I think, being run by the CHRI. And then, not least, is a very experienced diplomat and campaigner based in Geneva, Marc Limon, who is executive director of the Universal Rights Group, a think tank based in Geneva. He's based in Geneva, but there are offices also in New York and Bogota, and it is focused on international human rights policy. He actually founded this think tank and had worked for quite a while as a diplomat at the UN Human Rights Council. So I think his perspective will be very interesting in terms of how the UN Human Rights Council deals with these issues of rights, socioeconomic rights, and specifically right to a healthy environment, the possibility of a right to clean air. So without further ado, because we're trying to catch up a little bit of time, everybody needs, I think, a break in due course, I would like to ask the organizers to put up the statement and video from UNICEF that I know Henrietta Fore has provided for us.
On behalf of everyone at UNICEF, thank you to the Ramphal Institute for helping us shine a light on the issue of air pollution, a huge and growing threat to children around the world. Children are uniquely vulnerable to environmental harm. More than 1.7 million children under the age of 5 die every year from avoidable environmental risks. No child should die because of polluted air. And yet, air pollution contributes to nearly 500,000 deaths among infants each year. Millions more suffer from diseases like pneumonia, bronchitis, asthma, heart disease, and lung cancer. Others face impaired cognitive development. Pregnant women are at a particular risk from toxic air pollution, and as always, children living in poverty bear a disproportionate burden. Living in households forced to use polluting fuels for cooking, without access to the information and health care they need to stay safe. As climate change worsens around the world, we need to act, and urgently. We need to support children's right to a safe, clean, and healthy environment, no matter where they live. Last October, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a historic resolution. It called on the world to protect children from environmental harm and include the right to a healthy environment across national legislation, plans, and policies. To make this happen, Unicef is working shoulder to shoulder with governments to put children's rights at the heart of climate policies and actions. Since 2019, we've developed and implemented air pollution programs in 13 countries. This includes programs with youth to collect real-time data about pollution in their neighborhoods and campaigns to raise awareness about climate change and its impacts on health. We also call on all governments to join the 12 countries that have already signed the Declaration on Children, Youth, and Climate Action, launched at COP25. This landmark declaration sets out concrete steps that governments can take to address the environmental crisis across communities, with a specific focus on the needs of children and young people. But UNICEF also recognizes that governments cannot act alone. We all have a role to play, and that is why partnerships are at the heart of UNICEF's new global program framework on healthy environments for healthy children. This approach calls for the public and private sectors to join together with civil society and communities to develop and scale up solutions that can help us shape a cleaner, safer, healthier future for all children. We need the support of the Ramphal Institute and its board of expert trustees to help us. Let us join forces to turn up the volume on this important issue, to rally others to our cause, and to help develop the solutions that can brighten the futures of tens of millions of children around the world, this generation and the next. Let's stand with children and heed their call for action on the environment. Thank you.
Намайг Наранбаатарын төгөлдөр гэдэг. Би 17 настай. Нийслэл Улаанбаатар хотын толгойд бага наранд аав ээж 2 дүүтэйг амьдардаг. Агаарын бохирдлын гол шалтгаан нь миний бодлоор Улаанбаатар хотын 70% нь гэр хороол байдаг. Тэгээ 220 мянган айл өрх гэж үзэж байна. Тэгээд жилийн 3 улирал мэдээж хавар, намар, өвөл бүгд гал төлөхийн тулд одоо нүүрс, шахмал, түлш тэгээд мод бүгдийн төлөх нь. Тэгээд тэр бүгдээс мэдээж утаа гарна. Тэгээд тэр бүгд нийлсээр одоо агаарын дэм бохирдолд бид нар өртөж чинь гэж бодож байна. Миний анзаарснаар миний үе болон манай доод үеийнхэн мөн дээрээс нь оюутан ах эгч нар шалгалтын дээрээ сайн төвлөрч чадахгүй. Тэгээд хичээл дээрээ одоо ингээд амархан мартдаг хичээл намаа нэг тиймэрхүү асуудалтай байна гэж би анзаарч байгаа. Мэдээж одоо энэ утааны асуудлаас болж утаа яаж алга болох вэ гэж би маш их бодсон. Тэгээд одоо Монголд бол одоо нарны эрчим хүчээр тэгээд усан цахилгаан станц тэгээд одоо салхины сэнсээр гээд 3 эрчим хүч авч штэ. Тэгээ энэ 3-ыг одоо их олшруулад бүгдээрээ тийм эрчим хүчээр цахилгаанч болдгоо мó гэж би одоо бас бодож байгаа. Агаарын бохирдлыг би анх мэдээ орсон цагаас ер нь бол мэдэрч эхэлсэн. Манай ээж ер нь өөрөө астмтай хүн. Зутааны улмаас ээжийн минь астм маш хүндэрч байнга ханиалгадаг. Тийм учраас би энэ утааг байхгүй болгочихсон гэж маш их боддог. Тэгээ ээжийн минь над тэгж харагдах надад амар хэцүү байдаг. Би юухэн сургалтанд хамрагдсанаар утаанд бидний биед ямар сөрөг нөлөө үзүүлдэг юм, бидний явж байгаа газар бүрт ямар төвшнөр байдгийг гэдгийг би мэдэж авсан. Бидний өдөр тутмын явдаг газар, дэлгүүр, хороодууд, сургууль, цэцэрлэг гэх мэт. PM 2.5-аар үзэхэд 300-аар зааж исэн стандарт төвшнөөс 12 дахин илүү гэж тооцож байгаа. Бид нар агаарын бохирдлын тухай олсон мэдээллээ найз нөхөд болон гэр бүл агаарын бохирдол өртөж байгаа тэр хүмүүст хүрэхийн тулд сошиал орчноор түгэж хэлсэн. За, you can page хуудас болон хүн болгоны өдөр тутмын хэрэгэлдэг пэйжүүдээр тарааж эхэлсэн байна. Олон нийтийн сүлжээгээр цацгаас гадна бид нар хүн болгонтой тулж харьцаж, тулж мэдээлэл өгөхийн тулд сургалтад оруулсан байгаа. Мэдээж ойр байрлах цэцэрлэг сургуультай. За, энэ сургалтаараа бид нар юу түгээхийг хүссэн бэ гэхээр утаанд бидний биед ингэж нөлөөлдөг юм байна. Биднэрт утаа ийм байт юм. Та нар утаанаас ингэж сэргийлж чадах юм байна гэдэг талаар хүн болгонд тулж мэдээлэл өгч чадсан. Би мэдээж утаагүй, ногоон, одоо яг л гадаад уучигтэй, шин дотроо ногоон ургуулдаг, зүйлэгтэй тийм газар л амьдрахыг хүсэж байна ирээдүйд. За, мэдээж утаагүй болохын тулд бид нар нүүрс төлөхгүй, гээр мод төлөхгүйгээр яаж гэрээ дулаацуулах вэ гэдэг асуудал мөн гарч ирнэ. Тэгэхэд бид нар нарны эрчим хүчээр цахилгаан гаргаж ч юм уу гэрээ тэгж дулаацуулдаг болвол мэдээж бидний амьдарч байгаа газар таагүй болох байхаа гэж би боддог. Томчуудад хандаж хэлэхэд нөхөн сэргээх эрчим хүчинд суурилсан шийдлийг биднэрт шийдэж өгөөч гэж хүсэж байна.
Well, thank you very much indeed to Henrietta, Fore and to Unicef. I should add in relation to that last contribution from the young man in Mongolia, not a Commonwealth country, but when I was in Delhi, India, in February last year and visiting the Unicef office, I was told about a scheme for young ambassadors around India, young Unicef ambassadors who were campaigning on clean air, as well as other issues to do with children. I think we should therefore move straight away to the next recorded contribution from Dr. David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur for a Right to Breathe.
I am the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. I was appointed by the Human Rights Council in August of 2018 to succeed Professor John Knox, who was the first Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Ladies and gentlemen, we live on the only planet in the universe that is known to support life. This miraculous blue-green ball is our home, and yet society is causing unprecedented levels of environmental degradation. Since the Industrial Revolution, levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere have risen to over 400 parts per million, the highest level in 650,000 years, triggering dangerous and unpredictable climate change. Rates of extinction are 100 times higher than normal, indicating that humans are causing the 6th max extinction in the 3.8 billion years of life on this planet. And we're in the midst of a global water crisis characterized by water pollution, water scarcity, and water-related disasters. The climate emergency, the decline of biodiversity, and the global water crisis have major consequences for the enjoyment of human rights, which I have addressed in other reports to the United Nations. But for my first report to the Human Rights Council in 2019, I focused on air pollution, which inflicts more pain, suffering, and death on humanity than any other environmental risk today. Air pollution causes more than 7 million premature deaths per year, including the deaths of more than 600,000 children aged 5 or younger. In other words, polluted air is responsible for more deaths each year than war, murder, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, and malaria combined. And this is the tip of the iceberg, for air pollution harms the health of hundreds of millions of people every year. Indeed, the World Health Organization estimates that 90% of the world's population is exposed to levels of air pollution above WHO air quality guidelines. 7 million premature deaths. That's 800 deaths per hour. Every 5 seconds, a human life ending prematurely because of exposure to air pollution. Since a coroner's report last December concluded that Ella Kissy-DeBra's death was caused by air pollution, we can now put a human face on this catastrophic problem. Air pollution in London, England killed this beautiful child. So let us act swiftly and in honor of her memory. Air pollution and the shocking statistics about its impact on human health and human rights are the product of household air pollution or indoor air pollution and ambient or outdoor air pollution. Household air pollution is generated by the use of solid fuels, wood, crop residues, and coal for cooking and heating within the home, as well as by burning kerosene for lighting. Ambient air pollution is caused by electricity generation from burning fossil fuels or biomass, by industry, agriculture, transportation, and poor waste management. Here are 2 lungs. Now, healthy lungs are pink. The lung on the left belonged to an individual exposed to moderate levels of air pollution, and the lung on the right belonged to an individual exposed to high levels of air pollution. Air pollution causes respiratory illness and infections while exacerbating conditions such as asthma. It also causes lung cancer. But air pollution is also a major cause of heart disease and stroke. Recent research reveals that air pollution exposure also raises the risk of adverse birth outcomes, such as low birth weight and preterm birth. Exposure impairs neurological development in childhood and contributes to neurological disorders such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's diseases. Another key fact is that risks related to air pollution are unfairly distributed. Among the most severely harmed are women, children, the elderly, minorities, indigenous peoples, persons living in poverty, people with pre-existing health conditions, and people who fall into several of these categories. In states where household air pollution is prevalent, of course, women suffer the highest levels of exposure because of their primary role in cooking. The majority of deaths and illnesses attributed to air pollution affect people in low and middle income countries. And a study published in 2016 by the World Bank estimated that the global costs of air pollution exceed $5 trillion per year. Staggering sum. In light of this clear and compelling evidence, there is no doubt that poor air quality threatens a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, and the rights of the child. Air pollution also clearly violates the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stated at the World Health Organization's first global conference on air pollution and health, quote, "There can be no doubt that all human beings are entitled to breathe clean air." And yet there is a glaring gap in the global human rights system. The time has come for the United Nations to recognize the fundamental right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Human life, health, well-being, and dignity depend on access to clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, a toxic-free environment, healthy biodiversity and ecosystems, and a safe climate. Although the United Nations has not yet recognized the right to a healthy environment, many member states have done so. At least 130 states have ratified regional human rights treaties that explicitly include this right. Treaties covering Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the Middle East, parts of Asia, and Europe. The right to a healthy environment actually enjoys constitutional status in more than 100 countries, and over 100 states include this right in their environmental legislation. In total, 80% of the world's countries, or more than 150 states, legally recognize the right to live in a healthy environment. And this includes an increasing majority of Commonwealth states, as Kenya, Jamaica, and Fiji have recently added the right to a healthy environment to their constitutions. But this map also has some glaring gaps. You can see Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand do not yet legally recognize the right to a healthy environment. Nevertheless, states have legal obligations to protect the enjoyment of human rights from environmental harm. My predecessor, John Knox, created framework principles on human rights and the environment that set forth 3 categories of obligations: procedural, substantive, and special obligations towards people living in vulnerable situations. My 2019 report to the Human Rights Council on the right to breathe clean air outlines 7 key steps that all states must take to fulfill their human rights obligations by reducing air pollution to acceptable levels. First, states must monitor air quality. Many states indicated to me that they have expanded or are planning to expand their air quality monitoring infrastructure. And to India's credit, it has added many air quality monitoring stations in recent years. Second, states must identify the sources of air pollution, which of course vary from nation to nation and regionally within nations. For example, the main source in one country could be air pollution or coal-fired electricity generation or transportation. Ranking sources is a vital prerequisite to determining priorities for action. Third, states must engage the public, offering education about the causes and consequences of air pollution, providing information about the levels and sources of air pollution, and enabling public participation in decisions that could affect air quality. And finally, of course, ensuring access to justice and effective remedies in cases where people's rights are being violated or threatened. Fourth, states must enact legislation, regulations, and standards to create legally binding and enforceable limits on air pollution. Fifth, states must develop national air quality action plans with timelines and specific measures to be taken to improve air quality. Sixth, states must develop and implement the plans, regulations, and standards by allocating adequate resources and with strict enforcement policies. And my ladies and gentlemen, from the United Kingdom to India, this is the step where many states are failing, in the implementation and enforcement step. And seventh, states must, of course, evaluate progress, and if it is not satisfactory, revise their plans to be stronger and more expeditious in achieving the air quality standards. My report also contains extensive examples of good practices in each of these 7 categories. For example, France, the Philippines, and the Dominican Republic have laws that specifically identify their citizens' right to breathe clean air. 2 initiatives that dramatically improved air quality in many countries were laws phasing out leaded gasoline and reducing the sulfur content of transport fuels. These actions produced enormous health, environmental, and economic benefits, valued in the trillions of dollars. In India and Indonesia, government programs have provided clean cook stoves and clean fuel free of charge to over 100 million low-income households, a remarkable accomplishment, yet there is still more work to be done. Since the enactment of the Clean Air Act in 1970, the American economy has grown by over 200%, while emissions of 6 major air pollutants fell by over 60%. In recent years, China has moved aggressively to reduce air pollution, implementing and enforcing the law on the prevention and control of atmospheric pollution to produce impressive progress. Many of the activities that harm air quality also contribute to climate change, and so well-designed policies can simultaneously reduce the emissions contributing to air pollution and climate change, producing a double dividend. At least 30 states, including the United Kingdom and Canada, have pledged to eliminate the use of coal to generate electricity by 2030. And a growing number of countries have pledged to phase out the sale of internal combustion vehicles by a range of dates. The failure to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to a healthy environment by ensuring people can breathe clean air inflicts a terrible toll on people across the world. During this important conference, thousands of people will die prematurely, including hundreds of children, because of air pollution. Given the devastating impacts of poor air quality on people's lives, health, and human rights, we must take action rapidly and systematically with a focus on improving conditions for the most vulnerable. Air pollution is a preventable problem. The solutions, laws, standards, policies, programs, and technologies are well known. Of course, it will take substantial investments to address these solutions, but the benefits are almost incalculable. It is estimated that annual investments of merely $5 billion a year could provide universal access to clean cooking by 2030. This relatively modest investment would produce tremendous outcomes, including millions of premature deaths avoided every year, improved health, better quality of life, expanded economic opportunities, reduced deforestation, and decreased greenhouse gas emissions. A human rights perspective can serve as a catalyst for accelerated action to achieve clean air. It will empower those working to improve air quality and guide our actions towards a healthy and sustainable future. The Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly have the power to spark progress through resolutions recognizing that every person, no matter where they live, has the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Last fall, more than 1,000 civil society organizations called upon the Human Rights Council to recognize the right to a healthy environment. The UN Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the heads of UNEP, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization all support this step forward. The time is now. Fulfilling the right to a healthy environment by ensuring people can breathe clean air would help achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including healthy lives for all, sustainable cities, universal access to clean energy, and effective access to address climate change. Thank you very much for all the work you are doing to prevent pollution and protect human rights. And good luck with the rest of your conference.
Well, thank you very much indeed, David Boyd. We've now had two stirring contributions from UNICEF and from you, David Boyd, as well. We're lucky enough to have two people who are live on in our conference. First of all, may I turn to Sanjoy Hazarika, International Director of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative in New Delhi, for his contribution.
Thank you, Richard. I'm privileged to be at this session organized by the Ramphal Institute and FICCI. And my greetings to my fellow panelists, distinguished fellow panelists, Dr. Henrietta Fore, Unicef Executive Director, Dr. David Boyd, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, from whom we just heard, and Dr. Marc Limon, Executive Director of the Universal Rights Group in Geneva. We have an equally distinguished moderator in Richard Bourne, who was CHRI's, my organization's first director, and led it through its challenging initial years and has worked so hard with his colleagues and so long for this conference. A few months ago, the Indian magazine Outlook ran a cover story with a child swamped by smog and haze. The title read, "I Can't Breathe." And even as we speak now, Nepal has declared an air emergency. It shut its schools for 4 days, and millions of school children are being forced to stay home because of the bad, high pollution in air levels. Now, you don't think of that in a Himalayan kingdom, but that is the state today. And the photo of the child in the Indian magazine Outlook took me back 37 years to the Bhopal gas disaster, and on which I reported for the New York Times. That industrial tragedy at a Union Carbide subsidiary plant in Bhopal was a far-reaching cataclysmic event. It forced governments, the judicial system, regulators to develop new laws and regulations, and pushed corporate groups, media, scientists, and civil society worldwide to focus on the criticality of safe and clean air, but also of safe industrial processes. And those weeks in Bhopal shaped my view of the world, to technology and the environment. Unlike many others in this conference, I'm not a scientist or specialist. I have limited scientific understanding of these issues, although I wrote a book on the Bhopal disaster, essentially to help myself and lay people like me understand critical core concerns. My approach is shaped by experience over decades and field research and reporting and conversations with stakeholders and ordinary citizens. Let me take you to Bhopal in December 1984, where a toxic ill wind following that industrial disaster ended up killing more people than all industrial accidents in history taken together. And I remember Union Carbide in the United States saying it can't happen here, meaning standards are lax in India. But at one of the industrial plants, a few months later in the United States, there was a gas leak which spread panic in the neighborhood. So it could and did happen there, as it can happen anywhere else. So in December, a year later, the fumes from a leak at an Indian chemical plant in Delhi reached the Supreme Court, and the court laid down law. Bhopal provided a clear connect with the issue of polluting agencies and pollution. It gave us justice principles, not just in India, but in many countries of the world, as did Seveso in Italy even earlier in the 70s. And the leak at the Shriram factory in Delhi led to the Supreme Court laying down the principle of unlimited liability. The responsibility of an enterprise, it said, that runs a hazardous industry is not confined to the boundaries of the factory, but there lies a greater liability to the community outside the factory walls. And I quote, "It owes an absolute and non-delegable duty to the community to ensure that no harm results to anyone." So there is a deep and abiding human rights connection, as both the Secretary General of the Commonwealth reflected in her opening remarks yesterday, and as the Special Rapporteur has so eloquently spoken a few minutes ago. And this pertains especially to social and economic rights. The courts don't just make laws or lay down new laws, but they often ground their decisions on existing policies. They make these go further and insist on performance, accountability, and implementation, the last being the most difficult. The judiciary anchors critical rulings on the quality of air, water, land, and forest on one basic principle, the fundamental right to life. In India, this has been a lodestone, a benchmark of successive rulings on environmental issues. Air quality, whether it's indoor air pollution caused by burning coal or wood, leaves, and other fuel, which is used as fuel, the right to breathe fresh air, are seen as part of a public health agenda that constitute the right to life. Now, I'm sure many speakers here have reflected on the high levels of air pollution in Delhi and what's called the National Capital Region in this area, as well as many cities in South Asia and China. The facts are all before us. They are not state secrets because we encounter, smell, and feel these facts every day. But it's also important to capture some of the complexities of the challenges of air pollution. Indeed, the Delhi NCR region is arguably a learning curve for the rest of the country, and perhaps for other countries too. Governments, scientists, civil society, and researchers are making efforts to change issues and conditions, and these are not small actions. Coal power plants have been shut down. A network of natural gas filling stations has come up. Public transport is driven by clean energy. All vehicles have been eased out. But there are real difficulties, as we all know. Encouraging cycle transport or transport by cycle, or encouraging people of high income levels to travel by public transport remains a challenge. And it's as much a behavioral and lifestyle challenge as anything else. And all of us know that behavioral change is the most difficult to achieve. there's a proposal that by 2024, 1/4 of all public transport vehicles in Delhi will be electric powered as a decision to improve the quality of air. You could say it's with an eye to elections or a political decision. But sound environmental policies today are also good politics. Like the Clean India campaign, the call for a toilet in each household, that campaigned by the current government, an end to open defecation. This has caught public imagination. Pollution levels remain high, and we clearly have a long way to go to meet WHO clear air benchmarks. Let me just refer very briefly to the pandemic, because no conversation, no discussion is complete without a reference to COVID-19. The lockdown last year created actually clean air, and you saw blue skies in Delhi after many years. But today, it's back to usual. You are not seeing blue skies and you're not breathing clean air. So the question is, does it really need a pandemic to force us to do the things that we really basically need to do? But we need to think beyond the idea of the city or urban and municipal limits, because air like water, rivers, mountains, wildlife, and forests does not recognize borders. Therefore, the scale of action cannot be just a national capital region, whether it's this or any other. That won't work. And a top-down approach cannot and will not work. Therefore, a UN declaration on the right to clean air is not going to change things. This is even embedded in Article 51 of the Indian Constitution, for instance. But change has to be driven by local constituencies, local campaigns, local regulators, local bodies, officials, and political leaders. India has, in the past years and decades, built more air quality monitoring stations than it has in the previous decades. But all this has to be connected. It can't be just one or two municipalities, but many across the region together, working together, collaborating and learning from each other. In a country of this size, or China or anywhere else, scale does matter. You have to link the national and international to the local. Many good practices exist. How do you scale them up? You need to allot enough financial and human resources and the use of technology and the double-edged sword, social media. I'd like to briefly look at the issue of public opinion and the role of the media, because I come, as Richard does too, from a media background. Whether it's general media or specialist media, media has created spaces for public debate. It may be tilted, for instance, in a city like Delhi or perhaps Beijing or Rio, any large, great city, New York, London, with its unique problems than any other major metro in the country. But as the air pollution specialist, Anumita Roy Choudhury, says, air pollution is part of household conversation. But my takeaway, I'm quoting her, is that we have to focus on solutions, not just talk about the problem. Beyond a point, talking about the problem does not give us traction. Solutions, just like the problems today, are more complex and linked to so many dimensions, including waste management. And for this, you need political and public support. Now, how do you make governments and corporates accountable? This is something I'm sure that the conference has been engaged in for some time. And we cannot shy away from new standards which have been notified. And there is, as the special rapporteur said, and the UNICEF head said, there is a gap between implementation of policies and the announcement of policies. There's also a huge pushback, and let us not be mild in saying this. There's a huge pushback from industry and lifestyle pressures. As I said, people don't want to use cycles or public transport. But if the latter becomes more efficient and better, there will be more travelers. This in turn will ease the pressure on roads as well as fossil fuel consumption and our own bills. A brief reference to air pollution created by stubble burning, because this is, shall we say, a visual that captures the attention of the world post-October in northern India, this brown blanket that covers northern India. This is an issue comes up every year. It's been spoken of here, surely. It's not limited to one area, although it causes a stink here because Delhi, like all capitals, is powerful and the seat of political power. That's why I emphasize the need for a larger regional strategy, like a Gangetic Plains approach. Now, you have river basin approaches, People talk about, they don't just talk about river valleys. There is the concept of the river basin as an approach to tackle issues relating to rivers. You need, at the minimum, to work along those lines for air pollution too. And as far as the farmers are concerned, they're not the villains. They're often burning because of a lack of alternatives. You need enough machines and systems that mulch the straw, mix it with soil, create the compost and natural fertilizers, can use it for biofuel, so that burning becomes the last option and not the first or only one. And it's not just governments which have to step in here with rules which are well intended, but industry has to be involved. This is happening to some degree with government corporations lifting straw, but you need business models. You need upscaling through a multi-sectoral strategy. And we need to make sure that industry and power plants are also held up to help to account in the scale of air pollution. I believe this can happen through three ways. I've indicated some of them already. Ensure that the Clean Air campaign becomes like the Clean India campaign, a national one, not urban-driven, just because rich and powerful and vocal people live in these cities. It needs to be driven by a grassroots approach with a regional effort involving collaboration with different stakeholders. And finally, you need to engage and share information and ensure that the access to information and social media plays a key role in driving not just attention, but also change. And this is where I close. The citizens' right to information through the RTI, or Freedom of Information Law, comes in. Yeah. These exist across Commonwealth nations, but is not made enough use of for focusing on issues such as pollution, clean air, and clean water. It is also where social media, that double-edged weapon, can play a major role. If it can be used and is being used to spread fake news and disinformation, social media can also be used to challenge stakeholders, shame and name polluters, but also uphold facts and inspire dialogue. Sharing of good practices and the spread of policies are key to a safer and better air future. And I think we can show what's possible when the stakeholders, and I don't mean just governments and corporates or activists, we need journalists involved, we need lawmakers, we need campaigners, lawyers, the government and citizens all need to join forces. And this great American singer, spirituals, Paul Robeson, and he had this wonderful two lines, which I always think about when you think about challenging issues. We're in the same boat, brother. If you tip one in, you're going to rock the other. We're in the same boat, brother. And it's a bit like what the special reporter says. We have just this one planet, and it's our job to do our best for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sanjoy. I shan't ask you any questions because I'm keen that there's some time for our audience also to come in. You are very modest because I know that it was the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative which was pressing for right to information legislation all over the Commonwealth. So thank you and the CHRI for that. And now for a perspective from Geneva, very experienced, I have great pleasure in inviting Marc to contribute.
Thank you, Richard, and good to see you, and good to see all the other speakers, many of whom I know, some I don't. I really enjoyed the different interventions. So yeah, I'm going to try and bring a UN perspective to this, because the broad concept of this session, as I understood it, was a kind of global push for the right to clean air. However, as David Boyd also alluded to, I believe, my central argument that I would pitch to you all today, but I'm happy to have pushback and have questions later, is that it's not really strictly anyway necessary to push for a global UN level right to clean air. And the reason for that is because clean air is the right to clean air is an integral part of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, which, as David Boyd explained, is, we hope, after 10 or 11 years of work, is nearing the point where the UN will recognize that right. And that includes the right, again, as both the executive director of Unicef and, as David Boyd said, the right to clean air really is a key part of that broader right to a clean and healthy environment. The other reason, and linked with that, why I think the focus of campaigners on this incredibly important issue, you know, the shocking statistics that Unicef has come out with in terms of the impact of air pollution on children's rights in particular, that alone gives us enormous urgency in terms of addressing air pollution and improving rights around air pollution. But it's taken, 11, 12, 13 years to get to the stage now that you could argue actually that it's taken 30 years, all the way back to the Stockholm Convention back in 1971. But while I've been working on this anyway, it's taken 11, 12, 13 years to get to the stage now where we have, I think, a critical mass of states that are willing to adopt those resolutions before the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly to recognize the international right to a safe, clean and healthy environment. So it takes time. So I thought today I would first of all just outline what we've done to push for universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and where air pollution fits in with that, and especially to draw out the role that Commonwealth states have played in that, considering the audience today, but also small states in the Commonwealth, which has been critical. And at the end, if I've got time, I'll briefly explain, or try to explain, what UN recognition of a right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, inclusive of the component around air pollution, would actually mean to people on the ground, because there's no point as adopting things at the UN, and Richard talked about this earlier, if it doesn't make any difference to rights holders on the ground. Okay, so a little bit of history. I did history at university, so you have to forgive me. I always have a bit of history in these talks. The push for universal recognition or UN recognition of the right to a clean and healthy environment actually started in 2007, and it started in the context of climate change. And in particular, a Commonwealth small state, the Maldives, was obviously deeply worried about the lack of international action on climate change and global warming. And the degree to which, linked with that states and scientists were positing climate change as a kind of scientific phenomenon, something that, basically line graphs drifting off into the future, when in the Maldives experience, it was something that had very immediate impacts on people's lives in the Maldives, and linked with that very clear impact on people's human rights, whether that was the right to adequate housing, because houses were falling into the sea, whether it was the right to water and sanitation, which Richard also mentioned earlier, because sea level rise meant seawater was overflowing into the aqua reservoirs in the Maldives. Whether it's the right to food, because warmer climate meant that different crops weren't growing as well. And the monsoons, of course, also were changing. So there were a lot of very immediate impacts. Ultimately, of course, in the Maldives, it impacted on their right to self-determination because it threatened the existence of the Maldives, and the right to life, because there were sea surges and other natural disasters. We say natural, a lot of them were, or at least enhanced by human activity, that were causing people to die. So a really important issue, obviously. And the Maldives' frustration with the UNFCCC and the scientific approach led them to, by the way, I was working for the Maldives at this time, which is why I know what was going on. The Maldives decided to take a human approach. So they organized a conference in Malé, the capital of the Maldives, called the Human Dimensions of Climate Change. And the aim there was to give climate change a human face. Just like the Unicef video did earlier, it makes people think differently about a problem when they see its human impacts. What does it mean for children, for women, for persons with disabilities? And that was the aim of this conference in the Maldives. The end of that conference, the conference finished with the adoption of the Malé Declaration in 2007. And that was the first ever international agreement document that said explicitly and clearly that climate change has real and immediate implications for the enjoyment of human rights, both economic and social rights, and also civil and political rights. We, as the Maldives, then took the Malé Declaration to the Human Rights Council and began an initiative along with other Commonwealth states like Bangladesh and the United Kingdom to basically raise the importance of the issue of climate change as a human rights concern at UN level. That was basically the idea. Linked with that, another strategy that we had was that we hoped by raising the human face of climate change at the United Nations in the Human Rights Council, it would also allow us to have leverage so that we could increase and enhance ambition in the Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC in Bourne, and it meets all around the world. So there was this kind of idea to use the human rights system to better protect and promote the rights of people, especially in climate vulnerable countries, but also transfer that knowledge and that understanding to the UNFCCC, where we hoped it would force states to increase ambition in the climate change talks. Through these efforts, in 2008, we secured the adoption of a first resolution, 7/23, by consensus, a huge number of co-sponsors. And that, again, like the Malé Declaration, essentially made the point which hadn't been made until that time. And by the way, big countries, whether it was India, whether it was China, whether it was Brazil, the United States, some of the big European countries, didn't accept at this point, Canada as well, didn't accept at this point that there was a link between human rights and climate change, at least as a matter of law. So it wasn't easy, but we managed to get it through by consensus. And it basically set a program of work going at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to start investigating the human rights impacts of climate change. That led to a second resolution a year later in 2009, resolution 10/4, which basically organized or decided to express concern about the human rights impacts of climate change and decided to hold a debate at the Human Rights Council. Around the same time, by the way, there was also a debate in the Security Council about the security implications of climate change. And we had that debate about 6 months later. And by then, I think even the naysayers, the big industrialized or industrializing countries, had joined to say, yes, clearly climate change has real and significant implications for human rights, and that we should use the international human rights system to better protect and promote the rights of people from the impacts of climate change. 1 or 2 years later, the Maldives decided to take a sideways step at the United Nations. They did so because climate change, of course, incredibly highly political issue, and really consensus had reached as far as it was going to go. The US, China, others were threatening to they don't have a veto in the Human Rights Council, but they were threatening to call a vote if we tried to push things further. So we took a sideways step, and we began the resolutions on human rights and the environment. And that led, as David Boyd talked about, in 2012 to the establishment of the new special rapporteur mandate on human rights and environment. We didn't say it at the time, but our long-term goal when we did those early resolutions, we didn't say it because it would have created opposition amongst the big guys at the United Nations, but our goal, hidden goal, was to eventually pave the way towards universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And the first Special Rapporteur, John Knox, that was the main focus of his 6 years in the mandate. He basically clarified the human rights norms as they pertain to the environment. And that process finished with, as David Boyd mentioned, the adoption or the production by John Knox of the framework principles on human rights and the environment. Those framework principles are incredibly important. I encourage people to have a look at them. What they do is they provide the substantive and procedural content of human right, UN recognized and enforced human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, including, as David mentioned, the right to clean and breathable air. I mean, all these things are in there. And the idea was we would then be able to take these framework principles and use them as the substantive and procedural content of a UN recognized right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And that's really the work that David Boyd, as you all know and saw very eloquently, has been doing over the past 3 years. He has 3 more years of his mandate, is really to lead the international campaign, mobilizing civil society, organizations such as the hosts of this meeting, states, human rights defenders, environmental human rights defenders, activists, businesses, mobilizing people behind this campaign called #TheRightIsNow, the time is now, sorry, to really get the Human Rights Council and then the General Assembly to recognize this right and start enforcing this right, including the component dealing with clean air. Last year, we hoped that this campaign would reach fruition. My organization, the Universal Rights Group, plus Unicef, UNEP, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, and the Commonwealth Small States Office in Geneva organized a big conference in January, February, where we declared our intent to secure this right in 2020 and launched the process to secure these twin resolutions at the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way. Paradoxically and ironically, of course, COVID is heavily linked with or related to the relationship between human rights and the environment, because it came about through humankind's failure to respect the environment and respect biodiversity. But in any case, it prevented us from making much progress last year. And so we regrouped and launched a new push at the beginning of this year. So we had a high-level event during the 46th session of the Human Rights Council in late February with David Boyd, with the Executive Director of Unicef, with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, with the head of UNEP, with 3 or 4 ministers, including Commonwealth ministers like the Environment Minister of Fiji and the Foreign Minister of the Maldives, And it was really designed to generate this momentum that would lead us by the end of this year to universal recognition. We also saw over 1,000 NGOs around the world sign a joint letter calling for universal recognition. And we did a social media campaign, hashtag the time is now, which basically was designed to create a buzz and put pressure on states so that they would recognize this right. I'm relatively hopeful that it will happen this year, including the right to breathable air and the right to not have polluted air and not to breathe polluted air. This right, including those components, will, I think, hopefully, touch wood, be recognised this year, probably in the September session of the Human Rights Council and then the October-November session of the General Assembly. If it doesn't, then it's pure, in my view, political cowardice on the part of states, because everything is in place now to do it. And so I encourage everybody in this meeting to really push their governments to accept and recognise this right. The possible naysayers are the UK, the United States, Canada, China, although China seems to be warming up a little bit. So anybody from those countries, please put pressure on your governments to do the right thing at international level, especially because they're starting to do the right thing at national level. President Biden doesn't stop talking about climate justice and environmental justice, which is all about the right to an environment, a clean environment. He doesn't stop talking about the right to clean air, especially in the context of the disproportionate impact of air pollution on African Americans. So there's really no excuse for them to actually recognise this right at international level. I'll finish then by asking and beginning to answer the question, would this make any difference? Richard at the beginning talked about the UN's less than stellar record on enforcement. And he's right. I mean, the UN doesn't have any mechanisms that it can force countries to comply with international human rights law. But I do still believe that this right would have enormous symbolic and practical value. Symbolically, it would be a capstone of a decades-long endeavour that has seen, to be fair, over 160 countries around the world now recognise the right to environment in their constitutions or in law or within their jurisdictions. And in many of those cases, we've seen in many of those countries, we have case studies and we've collected them that show that activists, citizens, rights holders have been able to use the presence of this right in law to bring cases successfully against the state, to lobby for secondary legislation which takes forward the right to a clean environment and to clean air. And ultimately, the right has there are lots of examples of where it has created cleaner rivers or led to the creation of cleaner rivers, where it has resulted in significant reductions in air pollution, where it has improved biodiversity. So it can be done, it does have an impact. And if anybody is interested in looking at some of those case studies and the arguments in favour of universal recognition of the right to environment, and what the substantive and procedural content of that right would be, I would urge you to read a report that the Universal Rights Group recently in February launched. I wrote that with David Boyd and with John Knox, the first Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, and it's called The Time Is Now, the case for UN recognition of the right to a clean and healthy environment. And I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Marc. As a British citizen, your final remarks were a kind of challenge to us to take up with our government the fact that it has obviously been rather wobbly on the issue of the right to a clean and healthy environment. This is strange this year because the British government is making a lot of its chairing of the COP26 UN conference at the end of the year. and where the Ramphal Institute and others are very keen that, along with climate mitigation of climate change, there is a recognition that a reduction in air pollution can be a clear benefit of a process of decarbonisation and clean energy. So you give us a challenge, and I'm sure some Canadians who may now be joining our conference because of the time difference, but over in Eastern Canada, it's now kind of time when they can join. I've just had a message from a Brazilian friend to say that she joined. So I think hopefully some Canadians will have a go at Justin Trudeau, who is quite keen on his environmental credentials, to pick up on this wobble by the Canadian government too. We have about 10 minutes, which is rather nice, before we break for our, in the UK, a lunch break, but for others around the world, a long-deserved break after 4.5 hours of the conference. So may I put to both of you this issue of what would happen next, assuming that the campaign in Geneva and the United Nations in New York is successful this year. How can the human rights movement, those concerned with health, public health issues, and many others as well, can actually capitalize on a new recognized right if David Boyd and all those campaigning for it are successful? How does one convert this into something valuable? I know that I'm told that the Supreme Courts of Pakistan and India have both recognized a right to clean air as a basic right. And as Sanjoy was saying earlier, it is kind of linked to a right to life and the upshot of the terrible Bhopal disaster. I mean, I compare the sufferings of the people in Bhopal with the compensation payments paid after the Clearwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. So what's the follow-up here? I don't know whether you, Sanjoy, might like to start, and then we could go to Marc.
Thanks, Richard. Actually, I wanted to compliment Marc on his presentation, because having had the pleasure of hosting him at a couple of our panels in Geneva, I've always been struck not just by his lucidity, but the imagination that he brings to bear, the wealth of experience that he has, especially when it comes to small states, because I think those two side events were related to small states and human rights, and he spoke very passionately and compellingly on climate change and the areas there. No, I think, Richard, essentially, I believe that, it's like saying that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the enjoyment of human rights of everybody, everywhere. But the fact is, states are pretty run by cynics. They're run by despots. They're run by people who do not recognize that others have the right to enjoy human, the enjoyment of human rights is for everybody. And that is, I think, the critical point, is that unless governments implement, and I was listening also carefully, I'd like Marc to comment on this, the role of corporates is critical, whether it's in the global supply chain or anywhere else. Corporates also need to be held to account. That's why I'm very glad that FICCI is a co-sponsor, a co-organizer of this conference, because they need to be involved as critical area of air, not just clean air, but many other forms of malgovernance is connected to how corporates conduct themselves. So I think this is really the key. How do you mobilize enough support for something that comes as a UN recommendation, or even as a right recognized through the UN process, and get countries at the local level, at the municipal level, at the state and regional level to really implement them. That is the key, and it has to come through combination, I believe, of the stakeholders, because the concept of stakeholders has changed over the years, and the human rights institutions must be a factor in this, as well as the media. I'll stop there.
Marc, how do you see? I mean, you've been working on this for years, and actually, I was delighted you paid tribute to the Maldives. I realize you have a special interest there, but it did remind me that small Commonwealth states sometimes can have an enormous impact. And what I was thinking of as you spoke about the Maldives was way back in the 1970s, it was Malta that launched what became the protocol on the seas, the sort of control of the seas. Exactly. And that was an extraordinary thing, launched again by one small state. Admittedly, in an island state, it had an interest in this, but it generated support, just as the Maldives did in this century, on the issue that you've discussed. But can you give us a focus on the likely impact, how it can be capitalized and how it becomes significant for citizens and small islands, municipalities and the like?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Richard, and thanks to Sanjoy for his kind words. It's always a pleasure, Sanjoy, to be at events with you. I always get a little taste of Indian literature when I'm on a panel with you, which I love, so it's always a pleasure. And thanks also, Richard, for your kind words about the outsized impact of small states. It's something I believe passionately in, and you're right, the Maldives, almost as a lone crusade for a long time, single-handedly brought climate change and then the environment back onto the agenda of the Human Rights Council, where it hadn't been before. And they did so not only with themselves, but also with the help of other Commonwealth small states like Mauritius, played a crucial role, and recently Bahamas and Fiji, both members of the Human Rights Council, both incredibly influential. And of course, Fiji recently became the president of the Human Rights Council and has spoken at a lot of our events, calling for the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. So you're absolutely right. Okay, to the question, I would say I would answer in two ways. Firstly, there should be a focus from everybody on this call and wider civil society on those countries which are continuing to threaten to block universal recognition and which do not yet recognize the right to a clean, healthy environment, including clean air at national level. As I mentioned, there are about 150 to 160 countries that do now recognize the right, but the 30 or 40 countries that don't really need to catch up. Mainly that's big Western countries, so Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom. China as well is there, but as I mentioned before, China seems to be warming up a little bit. So I really encourage all of you, especially activists and young people, to go out and argue with your government and tell them that they should firstly recognise the right to a clean and healthy environment at national level. By the way, Scotland in the UK is leading the way on this. In their new human rights bill, they do propose to recognise the right to a clean, healthy environment. The UK, therefore, as often is the case, is a little bit behind the times when it comes to human rights at UK level. The United States, as I mentioned, there's a new environmental bill which President Biden has put forward that also recognises, they don't actually, this is interesting for you actually, Richard, because they don't call it the right to a healthy environment. What they say is everybody has the right to clean air, water, sanitation, nature, things like that. So they actually do the opposite of what I was talking about earlier, but it's still potentially very positive. Canada as well, David Boyd was telling me the other day, that there's a new bill coming out soon which will recognise the right. So I think we are moving in the right direction, but definitely a little bit of added push from people on this call, especially young people, definitely wouldn't help. The second way in which I would urge follow-up or how to use this right is, let's say, it is recognised by the UN and all these countries that are outliers now do recognise the right. What does that mean for people? Well, I think the best way to understand the power of the right to a clean and healthy environment is as a means of empowering people. Let's say a country that doesn't have this right or doesn't recognise this right. The government, perhaps in cahoots with some corrupt businessmen, decides to put a smelter factory on the river where that they rely on to draw their water and to drink from. They really don't have much of a leg to stand on at the moment. Of course, they can use national environmental legislation, but when it comes up against big power politics at national level, and especially when it comes up against money, often these projects involve corruption between businesses and government officials, including local government officials. They often struggle. But if you make it into a human rights argument, especially if that right is protected under the Constitution or is protected under national law, then it changes the rules of the game, because that person can bring a case to the national courts saying their human right to a clean, healthy environment is potentially going to be violated by this project and seeking to block it. And actually, a lot of the case studies in the report I mentioned to you, written by myself, John Knox, and David Boyd, is focused on this kind of impact. Another way it empowers people is it empowers environmental human rights defenders or environmental activists. Often these people live in already vulnerable situations, indigenous peoples, remote from the centres of power. And the right to environment really, because it encapsulates substantive rights, including relating to air, but also procedural rights like right to information, right to access to decision making, right to access to justice. It really empowers these communities, for example, indigenous peoples or environmental activists, to really launch national campaigns fighting for more sustainable development. So fighting not against development. Often environmental activists are accused of, in Asia or Latin America, of being anti-development, and they are absolutely not, but they are pro-sustainable development.
Marc, I must stop you. I'm afraid, because we are out of time now. May I thank all our contributors. Henrietta Fore, with a very strong statement on behalf of Unicef, David Boyd, who updated us also on his campaign, and we hope it succeeds, Sanjoy Hazarika, my friend, in New Delhi, and you also, Marc Limon, from Geneva, with bringing different perspectives, and that's really, really valuable. This has been a very important session. As I say, it comes straight from our previous conference back in 2018, which urged us to push for a right to clean air. And clearly there is a lot going on. Hopefully, if the Special Rapporteur's proposal goes through this year at the HRC and the UN General Assembly, we all have something to take advantage of. But I would like to thank everybody, all those listening and watching. We have take a break now for half an hour until our ninth session. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you.